The winter of 1944 seemed older than the year itself, as if it had been growing for decades before finally settling over the plains around Brzezinny. The cold lived in the soil, in the beams of ruined barns, in the iron handles of doors that no one dared to open too quickly. A thin mist crawled over the wet ground each morning, clinging to fences and fallen cartwheels, as though trying to hide the scars of the land. The air tasted of metal, of rust, of old smoke that had sunk into the village months earlier and never left. It was a kind of cold that made sound travel strangely far, carrying the crunch of boots across fields and the rattle of loose shingles in the wind. Janek Kowalski knew these sounds better than anyone. He had learned to live with them the way a man learns to live with an unwanted memory, always there, always tapping on the back of the mind. Janek looked older than his years, not because of age, but because the war had taken the softness out of him. His hands were dry and cracked, the hands of someone who had spent his life cutting wood, tending fields, repairing fences, and burying more than he wished to remember. He had grown up chasing rabbits with a crude bow made from fallen branches, a skill that amused the other children, but never impressed the adults. Over time, he had stopped using it, not because he lost interest, but because the world had changed and made archery feel like a forgotten toy. Still, when he moved to the cold fog, something of that boy remained inside him, a quiet watchfulness, a habit of studying the land, the wind, the angles between trees. It was an instinct that belonged to a different life, a life that felt impossibly distant now. He lived with his aging mother and young niece in a small, crooked house on the edge of the village, where the fields began to slope into swampy patches of frozen water. Every morning he walked out early to collect with scraps, old planks blown loose from barns, anything that could feed the stove for a few more hours. On the morning, everything changed. The sky was the color of dirty wool, heavy and motionless. He felt the wrongness before he saw it, a stillness too deep, a silence that was not natural. Not even the crows dared to call. Janek straightened from the pile of splintered boards, his breath drifting slowly in front of him, and then he heard the engines. They were low at first, like distant thunder rolling across the plain, but the sound grew quickly, gaining shape and precision. German trucks. More than one. The vibrations trembled through the wet ground and through Janek's boots. He stepped back behind the corner of a collapsed shed, pressing himself into the shadow as the convoy emerged from fog. 3 trucks, 2 motorcycles, and a small armored vehicle rolled into the village square. Their metal frames gleamed with frost, their insignias sharp against the gray morning. These were not regular soldiers. Their movements were too disciplined, their equipment too clean, their eyes too alert. This was an elite detachment, the kind that arrived only when someone important had information, or when someone wanted to make an example. Janek felt the familiar pressure in his chest, that tight ache he had carried ever since the day his younger brother had been taken by men dressed just like these. He had never forgiven himself for freezing, for hiding, for doing nothing while his brother was dragged away. The guilt lived inside him like a second heartbeat. And now, as he watched the Germans spread out across the square, unrolling lists and barking orders, he felt that heartbeat grow louder. A wrong feeling spread through him even before he saw the papers. When the officer in the long leather coat read out the first names, Janek's stomach turned. By the time he reached the third name, Janek felt the cold deepen in a way that had nothing to do with the season. His family, his house, his mother, his niece, they were on the list, and no one ever returned from these interrogations. The sound of boots scattered across the village. Doors were kicked open. Shouts echoed between the barns. Janek pressed himself deeper into the shadow, breathing hard, staring at the frost on the ground as though it could offer an answer. He had no weapons, no allies, no plan. He had only the old instincts of a boy with a bow and the crushing fear of losing another family member. And as that fear grew into something sharper, something closer to resolve, Janek understood that he could no longer remain still. He would have to act, not because he believed he could win, but because doing nothing meant reliving the same guilt that had haunted him for years. The winter seemed to hold its breath around him, as if waiting to see what he would do. Janek moved through the village like a shadow, slipping behind sheds and broken fences, while the Germans tightened their grip on every street. The mist helped him, thin enough to see through, thick enough to blur outlines. He kept low, letting instinct guide him more than thought. It was the same instinct that let him track deer as a boy, long before the world had turned sharp and dangerous. Back then, silence had been a game. Now it was survival. Each step had to be placed with care, every breath controlled. The cold air felt heavier in his lungs, as if the winter itself were trying to warn him. One mistake, one sound, and everything would end. He reached the backside of old Mr. Zaworski's barn, the one that had partially collapsed after storm years earlier. Inside were scattered planks, old tool handles, and forgotten farm junk. The place smelled of wet straw and iron. Yannick slipped through the warped door and crouched near the pile of wood. His hands moved with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. He picked out a long piece of ash, slender but strong. It was almost the same kind of wood he had used as a boy. He tested its curve, pressing the middle lightly with his thumb. The sensation pulled at memories buried under layers of grief. Afternoons in the field, crafting crude bows and showing off to his little brother, who always laughed when Yannick hit a distant tree on the first try. The memory tightened inside him. He forced it down, kept his mind on the present. He found a frayed length of linen cord, stiff from age but still usable, and wounded between his hands to warm it. The cold made everything more fragile, more unpredictable, but there was no other choice. He tied the cord to the carved notches on the bow's ends, testing the tension. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good by the standards of a real weapon, but it was silent, and it was his. The simplicity of it steadied his breathing. When he pulled the string, the old feeling returned, not just skill, but control over something, anything, in a world that had taken almost everything from him. Outside, German voices rose in sharp commands. Doors slammed. Crying erupted somewhere near the central square. Yannick felt the pressure rise behind his ribs. He had only moments before soldiers reached his part of the village. He gathered a handful of thin, sharpened stakes, makeshift arrows. They were rough, uneven, barely more than pointed sticks. But Yannick didn't need killing power. He needed distraction, confusion, enough noise to bend the Germans' attention away from the families. He lifted a loose plank in the wall and looked toward the center of the village. He saw the officers around a table of documents. Civilians were being herded into a line. Soldiers checked houses one by one. A system, efficient, cold. Every movement of Germans reminded him why this small act of resistance mattered, even if it was invisible, especially because it was invisible. The elite units thrived on control. If he could shake that even slightly, the ripple might be enough. Yannick stepped outside into the mist and stayed low. He moved to the narrow alley between the baker's house and the old granary. From there, he could see the lanterns hung on poles around the square. One of them flickered as the wind brushed it. That was his first target. Not a soldier, not a gun, a light, something that would make the Germans look in the wrong direction. He inhaled, exhaled, and drew the bowstring back. The old creak of linen tightened around his fingers. His muscles remembered what his mind had forgotten. He released. The arrow glided without sound, slicing through mist and winter air. The lantern burst in a flash of sparks, sending shards of glass rattling into the dirt. German heads snapped toward the noise. A shout rose. Then another. Yannick didn't wait. He moved to the next cover point, slipped behind a well, and aimed again. A second arrow cracked against a supply crate. A third knocked loose a hanging shovel on a fence. Every strike came from a different angle. Every impact suggested a different shooter. He could feel the confusion spreading. Officers barked contradictory orders. 2 soldiers ran toward the northern houses. Others crouched behind barrels. They were elite, yes, but they were also human. Humans who feared what they couldn't see. Yannick felt his heartbeat climb, but not from fear, from momentum, from the realization that this was working. He stayed invisible, always shifting positions. A cold, trembling energy filled his limbs. Not excitement, something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Then he heard a metal click that froze him in place. German boots approached the alley near him. Closer, too close. Yannick pressed himself against the wall, bow in hand, breath shallow. If they found him now, it would end in seconds. He felt the old guilt mixing with the new terror, and the weight of both nearly crushed him. But the footsteps passed, unaware, pulled away by the growing panic in the square. Yannick exhaled slowly, his breath shaky but alive. His plan was working, but the cost of a single mistake had never been higher. The confusion in the village center spread like a cold wave, and Yannick felt it moving through the mist as clearly as if he could see it. The Germans were trained, disciplined, hardened by months of punitive operations. Yet even they could not resist the instinctive reaction to unseen threats. Shadows became enemies. Cracks in walls became hiding spots. Every rustle of straw sounded like a rifle being cocked. Yannick watched from a sheltered corner near the old well, the bow resting against his shoulder, and sensed the rhythm of the enemy faltering. They were beginning to search with haste instead of precision, and that shift, small but real, was the first step toward losing control. He knew it, even if they didn't. But Yannick also knew something else. Panic could turn on itself at any moment. What confused the Germans now could tighten into a hardened line of aggression if they recovered. He couldn't rely on a few broken lanterns and scattered sounds forever. The more they searched, the more likely they would reach his family's home. His mind kept returning to his mother's slow steps, his niece's quiet eyes, the vulnerability inside the house. Each thought brought a wave of dread that filled Yannick's throat and forced him to swallow hard against it. He moved again, careful and deliberate, working along the edges of the houses where the mist thickened. His boots sank into the wet soil, leaving prints he tried to blur with his heel. He reached the backside of a grain shed where the wood was rotting, and the smell of mold clung to the air. From there, he had a partial view of the central square. The commanding officer paced in tight, irritated steps, waving his glove toward the barns and barking instructions at 2 radio operators. The soldiers formed small teams, each one covering a different angle of the village. A methodical pattern was re-emerging. They were regaining their discipline. Yannick felt his fingers tighten around the bow. The window of advantage was closing. He needed a new disruption, something larger, sharper, a blow to their sense of safety that would unsettle even the confident ones. He scanned the square until his eyes landed on a stack of wooden crates lying near the supply truck. They were marked with painted symbols. Ammunition, not the kind that would explode from a single arrow, but the kind that would draw attention if disturbed in the right way. He crouched lower, letting the mist obscure him, and crept toward a broken side fence that gave him a clear line to the crates. His breath left faint plumes in front of him, dissolving quickly. He knew the distance was long, the angle awkward and the light dim. Normally, this shot would be foolish. But Yannick had made impossible shots before, long before war had reshaped him. He steadied his hands, remembering the afternoon years ago when his brother had challenged him to hit a dangling apple from 30 paces. The arrow had sliced the fruit clean in two. His brother had laughed for minutes. The memory struck him hard, too hard, and for a moment it weakened his focus. Not now, he told himself. Not here. He drew the bowstring slowly, feeling the linen cord strain. The wood creaked faintly, nearly lost in the gust of wind. He released. The arrow flew low, grazing the ground before skipping up and striking the corner of a crate. A sharp cracking sound echoed. The Germans spun toward it immediately. Some shouted. 2 of them raised rifles and ran to inspect the crates. One knelt beside the splintered wood, confused. The disorder returned, hesitation, suspicion, a fracture in their rhythm. But Yannick didn't stay to admire the effect. He moved again, slipping behind the granary. His heart beat faster now, not from exertion, but from the sense that something in the air had shifted. It felt heavier, darker, as though the Germans were beginning to understand this was not random noise. They didn't know what was happening, but they were starting to suspect a hidden attacker, and suspicion was dangerous. Suspicion made men ruthless. Yannick edged closer to the house of Marta, the village seamstress. Her windows were broken, her door half torn off from a raid months ago. Inside, the room was silent. He pressed his back to the wall and listened. He heard soldiers searching the houses toward the east, one by one. They were nearing the lane that led to his home. His pulse throbbed in his ears. He crouched, gripping the bough tighter, the wood cold against his palm. The fear that rose inside him felt different from before. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror of being caught. It was deeper, an old wound reopening. He remembered the night his brother was taken. The boots, the shouting, the helplessness. He remembered how he had hidden behind a door, clutching a useless wooden stick he pretended was a weapon. He remembered promising himself he would never freeze again. Yet here he was, leaning against the wall as the Germans moved closer to the people he loved. Something broke inside him. Quietly but decisively, he pushed off from the wall and straightened. If fear was going to paralyze him, it would have already. He had no right to give in now. He scanned the village for his next move, but his thoughts sharpened into a single truth. This distraction needed to become something larger, something the Germans couldn't easily shake off. Not yet an explosion. That would come later if he survived long enough. But another strike to their sense of control. He stepped out from the alley, moving toward a set of storage sheds. The cold bit through his coat. His breath came faster. His shoulders tense but steady. The Germans were tightening their pattern. But Yannick was not the same frightened young man who had lost his brother. Not anymore. He had become something else. Someone willing to fight the war in the only way he could. Yannick's breathing steadied as he reached the far edge of the storage sheds, where the ground dipped slightly and moisture collected in thin pools of half-frozen water. Every step felt heavier, not because of exhaustion, but because he knew the moment was approaching when his improvised tricks would no longer be enough. The Germans were adapting. Their officers were shouting more focused orders, reorganizing squads, switching positions to cover blind spots. Their confusion was thinning, and what replaced it was far more dangerous. A cold, sharp discipline sharpened by anger. Yannick could almost feel it, like the temperature dropping even further, biting into his bones. He understood soldiers like these didn't panic for long. They regrouped fast. They retaliated even faster. He crouched behind a cracked wooden trough and listened carefully. The soldiers were closing in on the eastern row of houses. His house stood near the end of that row. His mother, slow to move but stubbornly proud. His niece, barely old enough to understand fear, yet already carrying its shape in her wide eyes. They were waiting for him. They trusted him. The thought tightened his chest painfully. He could not let the Germans reach that door. Not while he still breathed. Yannick scanned the square again. Smoke drifted near the supply truck, the one with crates stacked in the back. He remembered the crude markings on its side. Fuel transport. Not full tanks, but enough to feed vehicles for the next march. Fuel meant danger. It meant opportunity. His eyes moved from the truck to the soldiers clustered near the table of documents, then to the thick set of cables running along a wall, powering the lamps and radio equipment. Each element formed a shape in his mind, a pattern he didn't consciously seek, but one that naturally assembled into an idea, a spark, a diversion strong enough to blind, scatter, and disorient. He remembered the valves on such trucks. As a boy, he had crawled under farm carts, poking at every piece of metal mechanic workers left behind. His father used to scold him for touching things he didn't understand, but Yannick learned anyway. Learned how hinges move, how pressure change, how metal weakened when struck in the right place. That knowledge felt distant now, yet alive. A memory made of instinct rather than thought. He slipped along the shed side, gripping the bow so tightly that it would press into his palm. He reached a narrow opening between buildings where the mist pooled thicker, almost clouded. From here he had a direct, though distant, line of sight toward the truck's underside. The valve was small, barely visible from this angle. Hitting it seemed impossible. No arrow, especially one carved from scrap wood, could cause real damage. But it didn't need to. It only needed to fracture the metal, weaken it, create a thin spray of fuel. One drop, then two, then a slow leak that would travel across the ground towards something hot. Yannick exhaled through parted lips, letting the cold air steady him. He felt the weight of everything pressing down, his brother's memory, his mother's fragility, his niece's innocence, the entire village trembling in fear. He felt the way his life had been reduced to the single moment. A farm boy with a 40-cent bow facing a detachment of elite soldiers. The absurdity of it might have broken him, if not for quiet conviction rising inside him. A conviction that came from knowing what he was doing mattered, even if no one ever knew. He lifted the bow, arms trembling from tension and cold. His fingers burned against the linen string. The mist swirled. The wind shifted slightly, pushing from the east. Yannick adjusted. This was not a shot anyone sane would take. It was too far, too unstable, too unpredictable. But Yannick had made shots like this before, shots people swore were impossible until they saw the arrow land. His brother had once joked that Yannick could hit a fly off a fence post if he was in a good mood. The memory made his throat tighten. He swallowed it down and focused. He drew the bowstring all the way. The cord dug into his fingers. His shoulder throbbed. His breath slowed. The world seemed to shrink, until the only thing that existed was the tiny metal valve under the truck. He released. The arrow traveled through mist, vanishing for a heartbeat before reappearing near the ground. It struck the valve with a sharp metallic snap. A small spark flew, then silence. Yannick froze. Had it worked? Had it even hit hard enough? For a moment doubt clawed at him. Then he saw it. A thin, glistening line trickling down the underside of the truck, dripping into the dirt. Fuel. The Germans didn't notice. Their focus was on the houses, on the possibility of hidden snipers. Yannick watched the fuel spread slowly, crawling along the ground toward a lantern fallen from an overturned crate. Its flame flickered weakly, starred but alive. If the fuel reached it, the explosion would not kill many soldiers, but would light the sky, shock the unit, blind them with smoke, and force them to retreat long enough for families to escape. The wind shifted again, pushing the fuel line closer. A shout cut through the air. A soldier spotted movement near the sheds. Yannick's movement. The man raised his rifle. Yannick ducked instantly, heart pounding against his ribs, so hard it hurt. A bullet cracked against the wood behind him, sending splinters into the air. He crawled back, scrambling behind a feed cart as another shot whistled past. His chest burned with fear. They had found him, or at least something close enough to him. Then it happened. A sudden whoosh. A burst of orange. Heat rushed outward in a wave. The truck ignited in a controlled blaze, flames climbing up its side before the fuel tank inside caught with muffled boom. The explosion shook the square, sending debris into the air and knocking soldiers off balance. A thick plume of smoke erupted, rolling across the mist like a dark tide. Officers shouted in chaos. Soldiers scrambled, some dropping to the ground, others running for cover. The village was swallowed by fire and confusion. And for the first time since dawn, Yannick saw a path opening, not for him, but for the people he had sworn to protect. The explosion rolled through Brzezinski like a sudden storm, a shockwave of heat and noise that tore through the mist and scattered shouts across the square. The fire climbed fast, bright against the gray morning, painting the frost-covered houses in flickering orange. For a brief moment, everything was motion, chaotic, uncoordinated, panicked. German soldiers dove for cover, rifles raised in every direction. Officers yelled conflicting orders, trying to salvage the chain of command. Smoke thickened, drifting low and fast, blending with the fog until the entire center of the village became a swirling maze of gray and firelight. Yannick stayed pressed against the side of the feed cart, heart hammering in his chest. The heat from the burning truck reached him in waves, warming his face even as the rest of his body remained frozen. This was the moment he had aimed for, the moment where panic overshadowed strategy. It was working. He could see in the frantic ways soldiers moved, in the sharp edges of fear in their voices. But he couldn't stay long. The Germans were already regrouping, pointing rifles into alleys, searching for phantom attacker they believed was hiding nearby. If they found him, everything he had done would collapse in an instant. He slid along the ground, keeping low, about tucked close to his chest. His knees sank into the wet soil, soaking through his trousers. The cold bit into him, but he ignored it. He moved like a man swimming through smoke, emerging behind a broken fence near the seamstress's house. From there, he could see the villagers being rushed away by surviving German officers toward the west exit of the square. They were shouting for civilians to lie on the ground, for others to form groups. Their formation was breaking apart. Their authority was slipping. Yannick's eyes darted toward his home. It stood half-hidden behind the faint lines of smoke drifting between the houses. He felt a surge of urgency. He crawled behind the next shed, then the next, until he reached the narrow path that led to his door. Every breath burned. Every sound seemed louder than it should. He expected soldiers to appear at any corner, but none came. The fire behind him had swallowed their attention whole. When he finally reached his own doorstep, his breath caught in his throat. The door was still closed. No marks, no signs of forced entry. Yannick knocked softly. 3 taps, their family's quiet signal. A moment later the door opened a crack. His mother's eyes appeared, filled with fear that broke into relief the instant she saw him. She pulled him inside with trembling hands. His niece clung to his leg, burying her face against him, her small fingers gripping desperately. There was no time for comfort. Yannick spoke quickly, his voice low and resolute. "We have to leave. Now. Through the back." His mother hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. She trusted him completely. They moved out the back door, hurrying along the narrow path that led behind the neighbors' houses. Yannick kept himself between them and the open spaces, guiding them through the mist. The fire's glow behind them lit their way in faint, wavering pulses. Each step felt like moving to the skin of a fragile moment that could tear open at any second. As they approached the tree line at the edge of the village, Yannick stopped and scanned the surroundings. No German voices, no lantern light, no boots on frozen soil. The chaos in the square was still in full force, drawing all attention away from the escape route. He motioned for his family to continue deeper into the woods, but before following, he looked back one more time. From his vantage point, he saw the silhouettes of villagers slipping away through different lanes, using the smoke and fear as their cloak. Old men carrying grandchildren, mothers holding hands with children who had never known peace. Families moving silently, instinctively, guided not by plans but by sheer will to survive, and all of them unknowingly protected by a man no one could see. The fire cracked loudly, sending sparks drifting into the mist. German officers shouted again, their voices strained and furious. They were losing the village. They knew it, and they believed they were fighting an invisible squad, an organized resistance force hidden among the barns and alleys. None of them imagined the truth, that their confusion had been carved by a single pair of hands, armed with a handmade bow worth less than a loaf of bread. Yannick watched a moment longer, letting the reality settle inside him. He felt no triumph, no pride. Only a quiet, exhausted clarity. The world would never know what he had done. His name would not appear in any report. His actions would not be honored in any ceremony. He would remain what he always had been, an anonymous farmer, a man shaped by the land, trying to protect the last pieces of his small world. He turned and walked into the woods, guiding his family between the trees. The snow crunched softly under their feet. The air tasted clean away from the smoke. A faint glow from the burning truck flickered behind them, like the last breath of a dying storm. As they reached deeper shadows, Yannick looked up at the pale skies slowly brightening with dawn. It struck him that sometimes courage was not about bold declarations or heroic charges. Sometimes it was about taking small, invisible steps, steps that changed the night for others even if no one ever saw the footprints. He knew the villagers would talk. Whispers would spread. Someone would mention strange arrow wounds on supply crates. Someone would remember the lantern that shattered out of nowhere. And soon the rumor would grow into a quiet myth. A lone figure moving through the fog, striking with impossible accuracy, vanishing before anyone could find him. The ghost of the bow. Yannick didn't seek the title, but he accepted it silently as he walked further into the snow, his family beside him, the village behind him breathing again through smoke and cold dawn light. He didn't need recognition. The only proof he needed was the warm, fragile hand of his niece holding onto his sleeve. That was enough. And as the mist closed behind them, Yannick Kowalski disappeared once more, not in fear but in peace. The war would continue. But for this one village, on this frozen morning, a single man had changed the tide. Not with a gun, not with an army, but with a bow, a spark, and the unshakable belief that small acts can bend the course of greater powers.